My personal comments on the Stonehaven River Carron Flood Alleviation Study by JBA in conjunction with related issues. I must first express my disappointment that JBA were not given a clean sheet to start from. All their modelling and computer calculations are taken from the conditions on the river after it had been subject to man-made alterations, which have combined to cause the present major flood risk in the town. I would have thought that the trouble-free history of no flooding from the River Carron overtopping at the Green Bridge for over 150 years while the weir was in place there should have cautioned the authorities against making any unnecessary changes to the river flow system, in addition giving JBA a strong hint as to what possible remedial measures might be considered. Similarly, if they had been made aware that for over half a century since the Carron became a river with its own individual mouth in 1948, the level of floods in the lower river have never been witnessed as being little more than half the height of floods being recorded at the road bridge now. The extreme height of the floods now, at this point, and for a considerable distance upstream, is entirely due to the complete obstruction of the river's natural passage down the beach to the sea by Scottish Water's rock barrier and forced diversion of the natural river course through their rock-built flow-confining channel. Almost all the very costly alterations and constructions suggested and recommended in this report, and costing in excess of £3 million, would have been shown to be totally unnecessary if the researchers had been in possession of all the facts and reasons for the previous flood-free history on the Carron. Had this information about the river flow had been altered by the authorities been made immediately available to JBA, it would have made the work of the people conducting this research much easier, less time-consuming and costly. In my opinion, and that of far more experienced engineers I have discussed this matter with, the easiest and most cost-effective and permanent solution available is to reinstate a simple natural rock weir of suitable length at the Green Bridge. This would prevent any floods due to overtopping of the riverbank from this location ever recurring in the future. From their report, C. Modification, removal of rock armour at coastal outfall. They assume not effective, says the official report. The rock armour performs an important task in reducing wave action penetrating up the Carron. Investigation shows that there is no benefit to be gained from undertaking further modifications here. My response: this is total fantasy. There has never been any problems with wave action up the Carron. Both the Cowie and the Carron at opposite ends of the beach have the same tide levels at their entrance to the sea. The Cowie River mouth is much more exposed to prevailing wave conditions in the most frequent damaging southeasterly storms experienced in Stonehaven, and has a much narrower spending beach in front of it to help reducing the power of waves. High tide has only any effect on both river mouths for a maximum of 2 hours out of every 12. The height of river water in floods, now as it passes under what should be the Rivermouth footbridge, never in history reached the present levels when the river was allowed to follow its natural course straight down the beach, spreading out over the shingle as it flowed seaward. We can clearly observe this situation at the other end of the beach, where the bigger River Cowie enters the sea. The size and extent of this barrier is totally devoted to supposedly protecting a wastewater pipe that myself and other experienced water engineers I have consulted have all agreed that Scottish Water should never have laid this pipe directly across the natural mouth of the river. Had the pipeline been laid up the beach on the south side of the river, to a point just short of the river mouth footbridge, it could then have continued across the river mouth at a safe depth under the riverbed just downstream from the footbridge before gently rising in level to continue its northward journey. Had this course been followed, none of the expensive rock development would have been required at all, and the natural flow of the Carron into the sea would not have been interfered with. Nature has never found a way of constricting a river and slowing a passage as it flows down the beach to the sea, but Scottish Water, with this totally unnecessary rock construction and river diversion, certainly have. When a recent fairly minor but at the time concern-causing flood took place, about 2 weeks before the most recent serious flood, I observed that the water level as it passed under the footbridge was by my estimate at least 5 feet higher than the seawater level directly behind the barrier. Had the barrier not been built across the river mouth, the river water level at this point would have been that much lower, reducing the level of flooding back up the lower river to well beyond the road bridge. In addition, if the river had been left to follow its natural historic path down the beach to the sea, it would not be a contributory factor in the increased total erosion now very evident behind the old town. Modification of island's twin-channel structure downstream of the Green Bridge. Not effective, says the report. Both the river modelling and direct observations on the night of the 1st November 2009 suggest that the island does not form a constriction in the current configuration, and modifications or removal would produce no flood alleviation benefits. A number of long-term options involve increasing the capacity of the Carron upstream and downstream of the island, and if sufficient increases in capacity can be delivered, it will be necessary to ensure that the structure does not then form a constriction. Minor point. Again, these assumptions are totally wrong, as you can clearly see for yourself in my short video of this area in state conditions. It shows just how much effect this island and other man-made obstructions are having on the flow of the river. It can be seen that there is a large percentage of the river flow actually flowing back.
You can see that the flow has greatly increased now, and there's no enormous wave as the water used to do when it passed over the tree that was part of the weir arrangement. If you look at the side of the burn, you can see that on the side of the road, immediately below the bridge, and going down from the bridge, there is restriction in the flow, and the water is actually flowing backwards at several points, so it's not getting a free flow and helping to accelerate the speed of the flow in general. If we swing across to the opposite side, and that rocks that have been built in, compressing the flow of the river over a greater area, you see that immediately behind that corner there's a large area of dead water, again restricting any acceleration of the flow to get it running freely down the river. And in front of the island there's a big back pressure area there as it deserts it to one side or the other, but it's certainly doing nothing to improve the speed of flow. I'll go round to the side of those rocks and you'll see the extent of the dead water and how much flow is being lost by the position of those rocks. Looking down from the bridge here, you can see how the water's trying to get down, but being held back and diverted, and more than half the width of the flow, or the potential flow, down the Carron Terrace side of the river is being completely restricted. If this rocks that were artificially installed here were cut back at quite a considerable angle so that the water just passed through the bridge and then had an escape down the Carron Terrace side, that again would relieve the pressure and accelerate the water to a very large degree, greatly increasing the chances of no reoccurrence of the last year's major flood. There's no possible reason why those boulders had to be built up there, because the water never ever flooded over at that point onto Carron Terrace, and the pressure being relieved and getting down the river would have made a huge difference. This is absolutely dead water returning back upstream and acting as a brake in the flow of the rest of the river at this point. Even from taking the pictures at the Carron Terrace side of the river, when you look back towards the south side of the river, you can see the backflow along that side of the river, under the wall, which is again a restriction on the rate of flow and therefore very likely to help to cause any future floods, because the full extent of the narrowed river isn't being allowed to flow properly. You can see in this picture just how big a restriction this piece of artificial landscaping is to the flow of the river. If it were taken back to a position from where I'm standing directly to the corner of the bridge, that water would be getting a chance to expand in area and increase the rate of flow onward downstream, and again would greatly reduce the chances of any future flooding. I would estimate that nearly a third of the potential flow of that side of the river is being severely restricted by these eddies along that south side of the river.
And in photograph number 1 shows the classical circular sedimentation forming up into a sandbank, clearly demonstrating that there was no flow in the dead water area, which I pointed out in my video. The island is a white elephant, however. The real cause of the problem is the Cross River main water pipe, laid right across the river at its narrowest point, just below the Green Bridge. The Green Bridge is only some 26 feet wide, and after this pipe had been laid across the river, the gap from the top of the water over the concrete covered pipe to the overspill point is less than 4 feet. Until the council demolished the weir that historically was sited here and protected Stonehaven for any flooding, the river at this point and for more than 50 yards upstream had always been around 3 feet 6 inches deep, not the stretch of shallow water now only inches deep that we find there today. The White Bridge is 42 feet wide, with at least 7 feet of space from the riverbed to the underside of the bridge. It was well known from past floods that the White Bridge could only just cope with the flood river. How it was possible for any person responsible for designing and laying this cross-river pipe could think that all that volume of water could pass through this greatly reduced opening, which is now available for water flow, is beyond my understanding. From the report, modifications to gardens on Cameron Street. Limited effect, the report says. Reference to old maps show that over a period of time the gardens in Cameron Street have encroached into the river channel and reduced the natural capacity of the river to cope with high floods. However, analysis demonstrates that these adverse impacts of this are limited to the river downstream of the White Bridge. Any long-term flood alleviation options for the town will require flood defences at the rear of the properties in Cameron Street. Modifications to the gardens in Cameron Street are recommended as part of a long-term option, therefore, rather than a stand-alone option. Further encroachment should be avoided. My response to this: I totally agree that the scale of encroachment below the White Bridge is a serious problem, largely developing from the 1970s onwards. I would suggest that it is unlikely that any of the title deeds of the properties in Lower Cameron Street will show defined areas behind the property walls, but they may well have old terms in them like to the riverbank. It makes one wonder if any planning issues were ever investigated or applied. In the 1950s, when I was a teenager, I fished in this area very regularly. At that time, the only intrusions into the river were low grassy banks in a couple of places where washing was dried. This problem of serious intrusion is not only confined to the Carron below the White Bridge. Similarly, upstream from the White Bridge, the bank on the south side in this grassy area has moved forward considerably into the old riverbed, greatly reducing the area available for water flow. At the end of the wall above the river on Cameron Street, as it joins Carron Terrace, you will find a set of stone stairs leading down to the burn. If you were to investigate the opposite bank in line with these stairs, but now some way back from the water's edge, you will find a flight of wide stone stairs. Up until the 1948 major flood, these two sets of stairs were linked up with a line of very large stepping stones, which had been used as the principal means of crossing the river on foot for centuries before the White Bridge was built. The river bank on the south side of the river started from the foot of these stairs. The grass area above followed the slight slope, still seen in the upper portion of this grass-covered area, but in those years the slope continued on steeply down directly to the water's edge. Now you can see where in fairly recent times a new high rock riverbank has been created, with the land behind it filmed in to form a fairly extensive, almost level, grass-covered area. It may be functional and look tidy and nice, but it has reduced the potential flow area of the river by a considerable amount. Now the flood water level at this point once again can only go higher, greatly restricting the water flow into the already under pressure White Bridge. From these stone stairs at the end of the wall in Cameron Street as it joins Carron Terrace, you can see that the riverbank beyond this point is dry stone walled. Back in the 50s, this walled bank was still in good condition for at least the first 100 yards. At that point, the stones gradually became ever more buried in vegetation, and the riverbank started to gradually extend into the river. As soon as you rounded the corner as you progressed upstream, you once more encountered dry stone walled banks Again here they were so steep that you had to be careful as you made your way along the riverside. The 1857 map clearly shows how steep the bank was along the entire length of Carron Terrace. The removal or improvement of all these areas of intrusion would greatly aid the flow and height of the river in flood. In conclusion, even at this 11th hour, would it not be wise to instruct JBA to investigate the possible construction of a suitable length natural rock weir at the Green Bridge? All the materials required to do this fairly simple construction job are already on site. We know from history that this option is proven foolproof in preventing overtopping at this point for more than a century and a half. With the accidental flood controlling measure of the culvert under a bypass, we know that floods coming down the river will not be greater than they are now. The removal of the man-made encroachment on the south bank of the river along Cameron Street would make a huge difference to the height of any flood as it reaches the restrictions of the White Bridge. Altering and lowering Scottish Water's wastewater pipe to pass at a safe depth under the river mouth would allow the river to follow its natural course to the sea, and would at a Stoke greatly reduce the height of floods in the lower Carron from the White Bridge right down to the sea. The cost of these alterations would only be a fraction of the £3 million plus being suggested by JBA for their present proposals. The ideas of flood walls, raising river banks and bridges after the long proven flood-free history of the Carron, to me appears like a case of jobs for the boys.